everyone, and welcome. I am Marni Stein, and I am the Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Western Governors University. Today we are here to talk about value for our learners. At Western Governors University over the last couple of years, we have doubled down on understanding when students arrive at WGU, what they're looking for, what problem they're trying to solve, what pathway to social and economic mobility and to high resilience career pathways they're really looking for. Then once they begin, we have also doubled down on making sure that all of our programs and competencies tag to marketable skills, and that we understand the value of those skills to local employers, and we audit that value every term over term over term, so that we can assure ourselves that the programs that we're offering are actually in demand by employers. Finally, we're really very interested in getting better and better at understanding what we call the factored graduate impact of our programs, that is, the ROI that students actually end up receiving once they graduate against what they spent in terms of time and money and opportunity cost. So we realize that this work is challenging, it's complex, it's difficult, and we often lack the tools to surface the data that we need to do this work well, and we often lack the incentives in terms of funding, whether it's federal or state, to support the work ahead on this front, especially for institutions who are dedicated to understanding how to serve students better, students who come from very diverse backgrounds, students who come from low-income situations, and students who come to us with perhaps holes in their academic background. So this work is hard, this work is challenging, and this is the work that we're here to talk about today with our distinguished guests. So here with me on stage, I have Michael Itzkowitz, who is responsible for shaping think tank Third Way's higher education's advocacy agenda. And Michael is here to talk to us today about new tool sets and new methodologies for understanding value and how the value of higher education can truly impact the social and economic mobility of low-income students and students of color. And we also have with us here today Greg Fowler, who is president of the University of Maryland Global Campus. Greg is a distinguished scholar and administrator and has been for many, many years a leader of cutting-edge innovation in higher education. So thank you guys for being here with us today. And we're really excited about the conversation ahead. So Michael, we're going to start with you. And your latest report, which considers the time it takes for low-income students to recoup their educational investment and the proportion of low and moderate income students that an institution enrolls, you surface many, many very interesting, very complex points on how we currently evaluate universities. Can you give us a preview of that report? I don't know how many of you have read the report in the audience, so we can get a sense. Okay, so a few of us have. Can you give us a preview of the report and your recommendations for best assessing higher education institutions today?
Sure, and thank you all for being here and joining us. We are grateful for your time, and we'll try to make good use of it. So first of all, why does ROI matter? Why do we care? There's a number of different reasons. It might sound easy, but also from a federal perspective, there is about $120 billion that flows to institutions of higher education every single year that is dispersed in the form of federal grants and loans. That is a huge taxpayer investment. From a federal standpoint, we want to make sure that this is used as effectively and as efficiently as possible. So that's one. As a consumer perspective, we know that there is, what we've been hearing about is that there's $1.7 trillion in student debt. People are very concerned about the cost of college and it being affordable nowadays. So essentially, I worked in the last, not the last administration, but the one before that, under President Obama, and in the 2013 State of the Union, he wanted to create tools and data so that consumers were able to assess and get the best bang for their educational buck. So I worked in the administration doing all this data stuff, and I was director of the College Scorecard, which basically was a huge database and a consumer-friendly site, but behind the consumer-friendly site, it has information on 7,000 institutions, and there's over 1,700 variables for each institution. So after I left, I started digging into this and thinking about how do we accurately define value? And there's no right way to do this, but I hope to move the conversation forward, and I'm one of a few, and now many, who are starting to think about this. And the way that I started to define value as I was thinking about this is, if I created something called the price to earnings premium. And the thought process behind this is, if you have stock analysts who are able to have a good sense of the value of a stock, why can't we as consumers have a good sense of the value of either a specific institution that we're attending or even possibly a college program within an institution? So I started to look at this and I thought, okay, how can we do this? So what I did is, we have this data and how can I use it? So I looked at this thing called net cost. It's how much students pay. Specifically, it's how much students pay after they have subtracted all of their grants and scholarships, whether that be from the federal government or from the institution itself. So it's their actual out-of-pocket costs, right? So let's just say I go to University of Georgia and it costs me $20,000 a year, average net price. I get a 4-year degree. It's going to cost me $80,000 over those 4 years to obtain that degree. Cool, I guess. It sounds like a lot for anyone. $80,000, but if you can make it back, it's worth it. And we know from all the research that college is generally very, very much still worth it. But how long will it take students to recoup that educational cost, and how can we calculate that? We have information on earnings. So I started to look at specific earnings at places like University of Georgia, University of Florida, all institutions across the United States. This data is available and there. And I thought, okay, of course people are going to earn a certain amount, but what's the premium? What's the boost that they're getting by attending these specific institutions? And the way that I define that is, how much are these students making more than someone, let's just say if Georgia, University of Georgia, in the state of Georgia, that have a high school diploma but no college experience whatsoever, right? So we have those numbers, and we can see how much University of Georgia students make in comparison to someone who never attended college, but is around the same age range. And I define that as their earnings boost if they make more. So let's just say that a student earns $40,000 more, which would be an absolute, a very high number to make beyond a high school graduate. But it costs them $80,000 to earn that 4-year credential from that specific institution. They can use that $40,000 earnings boost to pay down those $80,000 in educational costs over a 2-year time period. So that's how I define the price to earnings premium. It's taking the cost versus the earnings premium into account to figure out how long it takes students to recoup their educational costs. The good news is we can see that about 63% of institutions allow their students to recoup their costs within 5 years or less. Very promising for higher education. However, I also saw that 14% of institutions, about 442 in my sample, provided no economic return on investment whatsoever. That means that the majority of their students were actually earning less than the average high school graduate within the state that their institution is located. So I started to dig a little bit deeper, and I did this price to earnings premium for low-income students, where they get the best ROI, right? And that's specifically, how much are they paying? They pay a different amount, but I can also see how much low-income students earn 10 years after they've enrolled in an institution. So I ran this, and I was really excited about this, right? Like, this sounds really interesting, but what did I see as the results? Who came up as the best ROI for low-income students? It was places like Harvard, Stanford, University of Chicago, Yale, I pretty much mimicked the U.S. news rankings, right? So I'm like, great job, Mike. You made a new U.S. news rankings for low-income students. Way to go. But I also included the number of Pell students next to this within my report. And you can see that these schools that provide the best ROI for low-income students hardly admit any of them, proportionally and as a raw number. So I wanted to take another iteration. I started asking myself, what's the purpose of rankings in higher education in general? Is it basically just to reproduce the same well-resourced institutions year after year that are more exclusive than inclusive? Or is it to actually enroll students and leave them better off than the previous generation? I kind of thought that's what the point of it was, and I started to say, how can I redefine this within a metric or within a paper? So what I did is I took this ranking, how well institutions, I did a percentile rank on how well institutions serve their low-income students. What's the best ROI? And these places like Harvard and Stanford, they'll rank at the top. But then I also looked at the number of Pell students, right? The number of low and moderate income students, and I provided a percentile rank on that. And I multiplied them, and I created an index. And what happened after I did that? Harvard, who was previously ranked number 4 on where low-income students get the best ROI, dropped to number 847, right? University of Chicago, who was ranked 860, dropped to number 8. Or excuse me, they were ranked number 8, they dropped to 860. And who rose? The top 10 institutions that providing the most economic mobility, serving mostly Pell students and providing them with a really great education, happen to be all Hispanic serving institutions, concentrated in 3 states, Florida, New York, California. We also saw HBCUs who are so low on, who have been disadvantaged with institutional resources and funding for years and have so many other obstacles. I now have 7 institutions within the top 100 where they're usually never featured in traditional news rankings. So this is a new way that we can kind of think about assessing economic mobility and also showing schools that are actually doing the work.
So before we switch and talk to one of those schools, I just have a couple of follow-up thoughts and questions. So this is an incredibly powerful lens on institutional performance and value. And as I'm sitting here listening to you and thinking, reflecting on our own work at WGU, what are you learning? Are you just looking at that institutional level, or are you also digging down into program level performance?
So for low-income students, we're limited within the data, right? I can only use the data that's there, right? I can't make anything up. So for low-income students specifically, it's at the institution level. And what we can see is the earnings that they make 10 years after they've entered an institution. Over the past 2 years, the Department of Education has started to produce program-level data. This is only for graduates, right? But you can see within each specific institution how well sociology majors do in terms of earnings, anthropology, engineering, liberal arts. So from a consumer perspective, you can see, you can get a great idea of the ROI that you're offering, these students. And you can also see, there's tons of liberal arts programs across the nation. You can kind of see which ones are providing the best ROI from similar institutions itself. So from a federal standpoint, you can see which institutions are working. From an administrator standpoint, if you work in an institution, you can also look at your institution itself and get a better idea of what's working really well for students and where they may not be getting as much economic ROI as you would hope. And it's a good flag to begin to dig deeper, to ask questions, and it's actionable data that you can use for continuous improvement.
Yeah, and that is really an exciting direction. I cannot wait till we can surface that program lens. The other question that I wanted to ask you is, you're talking about low income. What is the operational definition of low income, and what can you see within that category? Can you see race? Can you see gender? Can you see ethnicity?
So the way that we define low income is from data, right? So the U.S. Department of Education specifically had earnings outcomes on families that made between $0 and $30,000 a year. So these really are our most vulnerable students. And what we know about low income versus high income is you can see gaps across virtually all institutions across the United States. But you can also see a tremendous amount of opportunity that institutions are providing them most of the time. Now, what's more worrisome is, I mentioned, these schools that are providing no ROI to low-income students. Now, what does that mean? It means, technically, that these low-income students are earning less than someone with no college experience, even 10 years after they've attended that institution. Institutions will say, well, we're providing them with an opportunity when no one else would. Harvard wouldn't accept them, University of Florida wouldn't accept them. We're giving an opportunity. But kind of my counter to that is, well, you're actually, rather than providing them with an opportunity, you're actually helping perpetuate socioeconomic inequality, because these students are attending a school, they're paying money for a degree that ultimately leaves them worse off, right? So you're leaving them even worse off than they were before. So like I said, lots of promising stories, and you have this program level data that we can use for continuous improvement, and I think that it's a work in progress in terms of better understanding, number one, that this data exists, but it's only good, data's only good if you use it, right? Or else it sits in this database collecting dust. But there's a lot of opportunity, I would say, for continuous improvement across all of higher ed, and I think we're just starting to scratch the surface in terms of how we can use actionable data to help us get there.
Yeah, and this, it really would allow for very strategic, targeted program and service development that we have not, as a sector, had the data to support ever. That's usually not a data-driven process. And now this data would really allow us to say, hey, in our portfolio of programs, only 60% of them do we see are leading to good jobs, high resilient careers. Could we improve that percentage?
Can I tell a story?
Sure.
So, Marni and folks like her, and Greg are doing stuff that might not be the norm. They're saying things that might not be the norm where I come from. I usually sit in a DC policy space, and I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. And the hope is that we continue to move in that direction, right? Not being afraid of our shortcomings, but acknowledging them and working on improvement. So I was at a meeting a couple months ago, and there was a college accreditor up for review. And I do all this work on ROI, and they're deciding whether or not they're going to be renewed for another 5 to 10 years. So I do my job, and I say, hey, I got this new report, and I can see that you're accrediting, you're giving your stamp of approval to 26% of your institutions that leave the majority of your students earning less than an average high school graduate, even 10 years later. You're giving your stamp of approval to 40% of your institutions that leave low-income students earning even less than a high school graduate, even 10 years later. What are you doing about it? How are you doing that? What's your plan? And they said, thank you, the Department of Education, thank you, Mr. Itzkowitz. We appreciate your comment. Now, certain accreditor, you have an opportunity to respond, and they said, my response is, we have no response. So I just kind of want to give a sense of certain, where people are at, and we're kind of, some folks, we're moving in that direction, but sweeping it under the rug is sort of where we've been for the past 20 years. Now folks that are more innovative are trying to use it, right? And those are the folks that I'm hearing is, we know this is here, we see that it's there, no one's perfect, and we need to use this for continuous improvement. And when I hear those conversations and folks reaching out to me from all over the spectrum, from institutions across the United States and certain college accreditors, and folks all across the spectrum, it's promising. So I'd say that we're moving in the right direction, and I hope that we sort of speed up that path.
I hope so too. So we're going to, speaking of innovators, we're going to, I have some questions for Greg Fowler, and for those of you who don't know this, he's got like the trifecta of innovation under his belt. He was at WGU, and then he went to Southern New Hampshire University, and now he's at UMGC, so I can't wait with that innovation pedigree to see how you answer this question. So at UMGC, how are you in this moment that we find ourselves in the world? How are you defining and understanding value, and how is that understanding sort of compassing what you're doing as a university?
So it's interesting that there are several ways that we talk about value when we think about it, and certainly it ties back to the question you were just asking about the institutional level of value. Do our students graduate and have better jobs? But it goes down as well to the programmatic level. How are we thinking about the various ways we do this? UMGC is Maryland's open access institution. Our job is to specifically work with students who would in many cases be the Pell Grant students and others. So when we think about value, we certainly think about where will students be in 10 years? How do we build programs that are going to empower them and set them up with the career services and the support mechanisms that are going to bring those things into play? But we also have to think about the nature of the programs and experiences we are trying to create, because a lot of the work that you're trying to do is keep the value and the outcomes at a certain level, but also recognize you're dealing with various populations who might need different types of tools and support mechanisms in place. So when you're thinking about value, one of the things that we did a number of years ago was move most of our courses to open educational resources. And within the first year, we saved our students $17 million in costs as a result of that. To do that, you've got to be able to think about who are the students we're trying to serve and what is the value to them, both long-term but also short-term. A big question that we talk a lot about is this conversation of, do our students get what they came to us for? Do they see the value in what that is, even if it is not necessarily going to be a degree? So we're spending a lot of time trying to understand that. A lot of our students are in the military. They're around the globe. We have, give or take, some 90,000 students involved in about 180 locations, about 100 of which are overseas. Many of them are trying to up their skill level, trying to upscale themselves and their families based upon the experiences that they're trying to put out there. That may or may not be a degree. It could be a micro-credential, it could be something else. And often these systems and regulatory things that we put in place are not necessarily tied to what our students are asking or coming to us for. So even the very ways that we measure success within the educational system, whether it's IPEDS data or other things, often track things that students aren't necessarily looking to us for. So if I have a student who's coming in and saying, I want to make sure that I get this skill set because I want to get a raise, but it doesn't require me to be here for 4 years, it requires me to take these 3 or 4 courses, does the federal government think about that? There's a huge conversation right now going on about short-term Pell, for example. Is the federal government willing to have this conversation that says, we want to help as many students do this with as little debt as possible in a way that helps them to move forward? So whether it is in the designing of the experience that we're talking about and the ways we can keep our costs down there, whether it is in thinking about the long-term experience and the costs years out that the students are going to have, these are all places where we're trying to design it to deal with a population that does not necessarily get a lot of press.
I think I think the larger question here is, once we surface this data around value dynamically, in some cases, what if we realize that for some students, the 4-year degree right now is not the opportunity they should be seeking for the value they need, right? And I think that's where these short form credential conversations do come in. We see it in our own, College of IT, where we embed short form certifications, where each one of these certifications could get you a fairly substantial raise or promotion in a field even prior to earning that first degree. So how do we think about that, and how do we value that, and how do we make sure that we can get students the resources that they need to go after that first step?
That's exactly right. And being able to, one of the things I've seen at various institutions is a lot of institutions do post-baccalaureate degrees, for example, and these are particularly interesting in fields like education, where you have to continue to get various types of certifications or experience or skills as you continue to move forward. But in many cases, to do that, you've got to sign up for a degree program, even though you don't need a full degree. But if you're low income, you're trying to get the finances to do these types of things, you find yourself signing up for these programs, knowing you're never going to actually take a year or 2 years, but you want to take these 3 or 4 courses. We don't actually have, in many cases, the systems in place that even ask the question, when someone walks in the front door, what does a win look like for you?
Yeah.
And so therefore, what is the value to you for what you're trying to do? And then when they leave in 3 or 4 months and they've gotten the skill sets and they can either keep their job or get a raise or move on to something else, we don't actually track that was success for them.
Yeah.
And the system does not actually promote trying to do those types of things. So we put all these countermeasures in place that get us away from trying to get students to do the types of things that they need to do. I often talk about my brother when he was teaching me to bowl. When I was a child and I kept throwing gutter balls, he said something I've never forgotten, which is that ball went right where you threw it.
Yeah.
And when we ask why we have the behaviors that we have in the system, it's because that's where we're throwing the ball.
Yeah.
And if we want to change it, we've got to be willing to say, how do we change the trajectory of the practices that we have so that we create value, that we clearly understand value, and that we create the systems that track that over a period of time.
Indeed, and it's so important because I was just reading about how the population of part-time undergraduate students who work full-time is the fastest growing and largest population that is considered underserved in this country. And for those individuals, only 25% of those individuals will graduate with an undergraduate degree in 8 years. I mean, so you have this large, fast-growing population of young people who are choosing to work full-time or having to work full-time while they're going for their undergraduate degree, and yet that package is not really working for them, and it is not providing value for them. In the end, it's providing debt, and it's providing pretty heavy-duty opportunity costs for not going after a short-form credential and then being able to stack that up into greater degrees of value over
Marni,
time.
can I just add one more thing to that?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that we're seeing among our population is, again, that lack of understanding by the system of what they're doing or their life circumstances. And the best example I have of that right now is about 55,000 of our students are somehow tied to the military. They are trying to, of course, serve the country, and at the same time, they're trying to get their degree. But anytime something happens around the globe, right now, we're, of course, talking about the Ukraine. Several months ago, we were talking about Afghanistan. Sometimes we were talking about the South China Seas. Our students have to stop and go serve wherever they have to serve. And so they go into it knowing this. I was just talking to 2 graduates recently in cybersecurity who knew when they started at the school that it was going to take them 8 to 10 years to finish because they knew these things were going to happen. But they were going to continue, and they did finish. Both of them graduated relatively recently. We don't measure it that way. So as long as we're saying what we honor is the 4-year degree, and to the point that you're making, Mike, as long as we honor you're in the top rankings because of these types of things, if that framework doesn't change, then we're going to continue to see these results that do not serve our students well.
So we have this new data and insight, and it's only going to get more granular and powerful as time goes by. How do you both imagine this is going to impact how we deliver financing for education, how we deliver financing to institutions, moneyed institutions, how we incent institutions who are willing to do the complex work and the hard work and the good work of really focusing their programs and services on the students who need value most? I mean, how do we think this is going to shift that ecosystem?
So essentially, we have virtually no accountability in higher education outcomes right now. That's sort of a fact, right? We have something called the cohort default rate. This is a law that was put in place 30 years ago. You can think about it's gathered dust. It was great at the time, and the reason why student loan defaults were increasing rapidly in the late 80s, they were around 22% at their height. So Congress said, why don't we put a law in place where if too many students default on their loans at a specific institution, then we won't provide them federal funding in terms of federal grants and loans. And as I mentioned, that number equals $120 billion nowadays. Now, what happened is a lot of these fly-by-night institutions that weren't serving students well shut down, right? We saw that their defaults were way too high. And what happened? The default rate dropped tremendously, beginning in the 90s, right? Now, since then, schools have learned how to game this system. And there's about 5,000 institutions in the United States today. Only 10 fail this rule every single year. Even though we can see that a tremendous amount of students are having trouble getting even a decent paying job and paying down their loans, right? We see all this information. From my research, we can see institutions themselves. You know, if it's 14%, that's still an awfully large amount where the majority of their students are earning less than someone with no college experience within the state where their institution is located. But guess what? There's no laws in place to prevent this. And as I mentioned before, accreditors are giving their stamp of approval because they're not necessarily looking at these outcomes. But we have this data becoming available. So what's the next step, perhaps? Right now, you know, there's opportunities in two ways. Right now, the Department of Education at the United States is going through a regulatory process to implement something called gainful employment. This is for a subset of programs that are specifically meant to lead students to jobs immediately through specific training, right? So if you think, I want to become an auto mechanic, you go take a specific kind of course, you become an auto mechanic. If you want to become a welder, if you want to become an elevator technician. And what it says is that if students earn too little and have too much debt, then they won't be able to receive federal funding. Now this is a regulation, so what does this mean? It means that it can be changed, right? So essentially, for a more permanent thing in place, we do need Congress to act. And I think that a more reasonable way for them to go about this is to use this program level data to assess whether programs are at least meeting a very basic minimum threshold to ensure that students aren't worse off, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what does this mean? It means that perhaps a whole institution won't shut down. We don't want institutions to shut down. No one wants institutions to shut down. We just want them to get better. And we want them to continue to provide the best opportunity. And what happens when you shift enrollment from low-performing programs to higher-performing programs? You know, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So we can see a change. These outcomes will continue to get better. So Congress needs to work together. I don't know, no laughs from the audience? Thank you. You know, and it's a process. But from a rational standpoint, you know, this should be very attractive to Republicans and Democrats alike. This is a money saver. This is a more efficient use of taxpayer funds. Let's not use them where they're not working. Let's use them where they are working. And this helps students. Yeah. We don't want students going into programs to where they're left worse off. And there are so many other programs that are the same exact program that just may offer a better opportunity at a different institution in a different geographic location. So really it's a win-win, and I think that the tide's, you know, moving in that direction. You know, we're continuing in the return on investment conversation, we're continuing to toss things that create ripples, and hopefully those ripples will soon create a current, and hopefully that current will soon turn into a wave.
Yeah, and Greg, as we know, this kind of change takes money, it takes resources, it takes change management. It takes time. What do you think? What do you think would really help in terms of not only incenting but supporting institutions to take on this important work?
So I think there are a couple of things I'd point out. One of them is I do think, again, these types of models that say students who come to us may not necessarily be coming to us for the sort of traditional one-size-fits-all packaging. I think that's one of the things we have to also deal with. Something we won't have a lot of time to talk about today, but I think is going to be a big part of this, is the growing number of non-traditional students in the population. It's somewhere around 70% of students are no longer that 18 to 21 to 22-year-old. When we're talking about the Great Resignation, we're not talking about 18-year-olds. If there are people resigning, then how are we thinking about the funding mechanisms and the financial planning that's going to help those who are non-traditional students gain those skill sets and change their lives as well is going to be a critical piece to this. And then the final thing I'll say for now is we've got to also get better at true cost of attendance. because there are all kinds of hidden costs. And those of you who know about the various types of fees or the discounting mechanisms and all the various things that go into the gaming of the system, all of that are things that are a larger part of the conversation that we've got to figure out if we're going to try to truly change the system. And those things I think would make a big difference.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so we're going to, I'm sure you have some questions or some thoughts to share. We're going to now invite you to ask those questions. And so if you have a question, if you could just raise your hand and Leslie will assist. Question, comment, thought? Yes, over here, the blue shirt.
Excuse me. Hi, I saw you first. I think. Yes, hi. Can you mind to stand up?
Hey there. Greg, good to see you again. Devin from SNHU. So my question is, more than a year ago, the Gates Foundation partnered in a report also about post-secondary value. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about comparison and contrast between the report that's just come from Third Way, that work, and how we might actually get more specific in seeing this kind of drumbeat that leads to actual institutional change. Where are you seeing evidence of potential percolating incentives and movements that are changing institutions and the system as a whole?
Were you talking about the Post-Secondary Value Commission? Thank you. So that's a report that was released by the Gates Foundation about a year ago. And once again, you know, this is a movement. They saw a lot of importance around this. They included multiple stakeholders. And what did they use to define no return on investment, right? There's a category there that says no ROI, no economic ROI is what I would call it. They use something very similar. And it's the majority of students who are not earning more than the average high school graduate. I don't know if they use state level. I like to use state level because people earn different amounts in Florida and Mississippi than they do in New York and California, right? So I think in that sense, you know, all of these are good tools. They created a tool, and I think that this was more of a consumer tool in a sense. And they say, you know, there's a lot of context that can and perhaps should be provided around each institutional outcome. Something really good and strong that Gates did as well is their focus on race and ethnicity, right? So unfortunately, this data is not there. I think Marni asked this question before, and I didn't include an answer. The information is not there at the US Department of Education, right? So we know the stats, and they're quite scary sometimes. A black graduate is more likely to default on his or her loans than a white student who dropped out, right? Like that took me a while to wrap my head around after hearing that. That's research by Judith Scott Clayton, and it's like, how could that be? And that's not right. And how do we improve? So there's no data there. There's opportunity to collect more data at the federal level. There's something called the College Transparency Act, which is basically a system to collect more information on students within a more disaggregated demographics. Gates has sort of asked from a state level, I believe, and I'm not a Gates representative, so they can answer better than I can. But you know, I think that they're trying to do the best that they can to get as much information from whatever sources on specific outcomes based off of different demographics that aren't available federally. I use low-income students because that's the data that that was available to me at the time. We know that there's a lot of correlation between, you know, different kinds of demographics and specifically students of color. So I think number one is you can't fix a problem if you don't know there's a problem there. And I think that a lot of these research, you know, this research is highlighting where these gaps exist. And as I mentioned, you know, just over and over, like it's not pointing fingers, perhaps, even though that's an easy thing to do. The harder thing to do is to recognize that this exists and to continuously think about how we can make improvements so that all students succeed after attending an institution of higher education.
Yeah, and I would just add to that that in the research that we're doing at Western Governors University on credential value and employer demand, that it is a county by county game in states. And when you look at that intersection between employer demand for particular credentials, whether they're short form or degrees, and then the population, the census data around educational attainment in that geo, like that's when you start getting the data that could help schools solve this problem of social and economic mobility.
So let's just expand on that for a second, right? So like, let's just say you're an institutional leader and you have 50 college programs, right? 40 of them are working really well. You have all this program level data that shows that these students are succeeding economically, right? And you can look at the cost that they pay relative to the amount that their earnings premium that they obtain. But perhaps you see 10 programs that aren't performing as well. They're taking a little bit longer for students to be able to recoup those costs, or they're actually, you see these students, former graduates, who are earning less than someone with no college experience. So what do you do? Or what does it mean? You know, perhaps it means that, number one, it's a flag to say, okay, there's a little bit of risk here. Let me look a little bit deeper. Number two, you can ask, is the program itself not working? How can I improve upon that? Number three, to Marni's point, is am I offering a program to where no jobs exist within this geographic region? And I just keep enrolling students year after year, even though the jobs just don't exist in this area perhaps anymore. Maybe they did, but now they don't. So I think that it's a process of sort of going through this and thinking about not what are the jobs of yesterday, but what are the jobs of now and tomorrow, and what programs am I offering to meet those demands?
And what are the needs of the population that really need those programs in order to get to that opportunity? I think equity lives inside of this problem-solving space, and we really need to dedicate ourselves to it. Another question?
Hi, thank you all so much. So my question kind of dovetails off of the conversation you just kind of moved into, but I was wondering if you could speak more to how universities and colleges can kind of address the differences in ROI between different programs, like such as engineering versus anthropology, and how they can do that in a way that doesn't discourage students from pursuing an interest in a degree that might not necessarily have as high of income outcomes as another degree.
Do you want to take that one, Greg?
Sure, and I see we only have a couple minutes, so I'll try to, I think one of the things when we're talking about the programmatic level is, again, what's the experience and how are we pricing? It's going to be a big part of that, and how do you think about the experience you're putting out there as a result of that? So everything from the academic support to the various other elements that go into factoring what does this program need to cost, and are we thinking about that? I don't know that you want to try to discourage students from going into the field that is their passion. I think what you want to do is try to make sure that they don't accrue such costs that it doesn't become valuable to them to do the areas in the ways that we were talking about this. So there are many different options, and I think one of the other things that we've got to get really good at is helping students to understand what those options are that will also provide the value. Which institutions could you go to that can provide you with a high quality experience that may also allow you to keep your costs down and at the same time pursue your passion as an area of experience. Right now, if we continue to hold up the standard as you've got to be at an Ivy League school, then you begin to do a disservice to schools like the community colleges that do an amazing job for students, and also allow them to keep their value down. It doesn't have to be an either or. An understanding of how we are achieving our mission is going to be a critical piece to that, but I don't want to discourage students from pursuing their passions as a result of that.
For sure. And I actually think, just as a quick add-on to that, any degree program within the liberal arts or inside of the sciences or social sciences can tag to value, right? There are so many skills and competencies and sort of mastery levels that students attain when they are moving through these degree programs. We are just not surfacing that value to them explicitly. And sometimes we don't even understand it ourselves as we put those curricula together. So I think that's the other thing that we can do as we're thinking about value in higher education. That doesn't just mean STEM degrees. That doesn't just mean IT degrees or professional degrees. We can make sure that we surface value to students from any educational pathway. If we are more intentional about that and we surface that value to students, I think employers will thank us because they need broad-based, adaptive folks who know how to think, who know how to reason, who know how to be creative, and that's exactly what those degree pathways focus on.
I think folks would be surprised when you look at the data, right? So like, you're gonna see, there's some unsurprising things. What are the programs that provide ROI almost all the time? Nursing, health, engineering, right? Just like you said. But what about liberal arts programs? At four-year institutions, they're oftentimes providing a good ROI, right? So it's just like, I know that's the concern, and there is gonna be a difference between liberal arts programs, especially early on, versus something like STEM or nursing. But you're gonna see a lot of great return on investment for programs in the liberal arts and education and other places like that, to where you might think that, that you might have some anxiety about. Another thing that some institutions, some programs that score, that are the most likely to have no economic return on investment, at least early on, are things like theater, art, graphic design, right? Now so they'll be like, why are you, Michael Itzkowitz, why are you attacking the arts? Do you not like theater? Are you not a cultured person? And I have to show these programs and I say, look at all these art and theater and graphic design programs that are working. There are still a tremendous amount. So I don't think that it's not necessarily, it's not an attack on anything, and it just kind of shows and it gives a better idea of what's working and what's a little bit more risky and what can be improved upon from an administrator, from a federal, and from a consumer point of view.
Yeah, and to explicitly surface value to students, whether they are theater major or French literature major, an engineering major, or a nursing major. So I think we're out of time. But thank you so much. Thanks for being patient at the beginning. Thanks for your questions, and have a great South by Southwest EDU. Keep it weird.